Construction work on the Sagrada Familia Catholic Basilica began in 1882. It's mostly finished and is expected to be completed in about 10 years. Antoni Gaudí was the principal architect from 1883 until his death in 1926, and he is buried in the church. When completed, Sagrada Familia will be the tallest church building in the world, and certainly the most unique. The interior columns are like trees that branch out near the top, with the suggestion of a leafy canopy overhead. Notice the symmetries and straight lines, which are not very Gaudí-esque. This is explained by the fact that the work was only about 20% complete when Gaudí died, and subsequent architects have not followed the original design in all respects. At least part of the reason for the failure to follow Gaudí's original vision is the fact that the majority of Gaudí's drawings and models were destroyed by anarchists during the Spanish Civil War. The stained glass windows, though regular in shape, do bring to mind Gaudí's wonderful use of color in his other buildings. This drawing in rich red porphyry stone depicts Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, celebrated by Christians as Palm Sunday. The lettering in Catalan on these doors recites passages from the Gospels relating to the last days of Jesus. This is the Passion entrance and depicts Jesus being whipped and then crucified. Gaudí intended this side of the church to strike fear into the onlooker. He specified the use of chiaroscuro to show severity and brutality. Later architects who endeavored to realize his plans beginning in 1954 gave it a rigid, angular form to provoke a dramatic effect. The Recinto Modernista de São Paulo, built in the early 1900s, was a fully functioning hospital until 2009, when it was converted to a museum. The grounds consist of a collection of buildings in the Modernismo style. Interior tiles are featured throughout. Why would a hospital be decorated as elaborately as a church? 100 years ago, people didn't go in unless they were very, very sick, and there was not much that could be done for them, so most died there. But also, working in such a grand temple must have made the doctors and nurses feel more sober and dedicated about their work, and that they were part of something greater than themselves. Has something been lost now that most workers spend their days in austere, sterile, colorless buildings? The interior courtyard of the complex is composed in a pleasant park-like setting. Compare the variation in the design of the buildings to most modern complexes, in which the boxy, dehumanizing structures are hardly distinguishable one from the other. Despite the differences among the buildings, there is a harmony to them. They seem to belong together. A graduation was taking place while we were visiting. How nice to be able to hold the ceremony outdoors on such a sunny day and amid such classic surroundings. COVID was still going strong though, so the students all had to wear face masks, as did we everywhere we went. Thankfully, mask compliance in the city was 100%. Here we see an exhibit of life in the hospital in times past. Notice the old wooden X-ray machine. Medical X-rays were in use from the early 20th century. Patients recuperating from illness or injury or passing their last days in this ward must have appreciated the garden of colored tiles on the walls and the sky blue ceiling above. The interior of the administration building looks more like a church than an office building. This is where patients checked in, and 100 years ago they would have arrived in a state of high anxiety. Perhaps the towering arches gave them confidence that they were in good hands. When they walked up this staircase, the people who worked here must have felt they were valued and that they were expected to take their job seriously. As we pass through the administrative wing, the decoration is unrelenting. What social functions took place in this magnificent hall worthy of a king, and why would a hospital have need of such a grand space? In its day, the hospital would have received its support from wealthy patrons, and treating them like royalty would have smoothed the way towards separating them from their money. From this window, we see a view of the Sagrada Familia in the distance. What is this room? A chapel? No, it's a classroom. I'm sure that any student who felt the urge to throw a paper airplane at the professor would surely experience the grandeur of this place as a constraint on such childish impulses. Who can imagine anything like this being built today? The difference between hospital architecture 100 years ago and now is easily explained, however. Back then, there was precious little that doctors and nurses could do for patients, so money was put into creating fabulous symbols that expressed a hope for miracles. We ended our Barcelona vacation with a trip to Montserrat, a mountain about 2 hours by train from Barcelona. A monastery has existed in this location for nearly 1,000 years and is currently the home to 70 monks. After arriving at the base of the mountain, we changed to a rack railway that climbs 500 meters to the monastery. The first incarnation of this train was built in the 19th century. The current one is just 20 years old. It carries some 50,000 tourists a year to this popular site, which can also be reached by road or by cable car. Surprisingly, the peculiar rock formations that characterize this mountain are not volcanic in origin. They were formed from undersea sediment 45 million years ago that was then thrust up by plate tectonics and ultimately eroded into the current shapes. We arrived at this station. In a normal year, there would be crowds, but as was the case everywhere in Barcelona, the numbers were low due to the COVID pandemic. Montserrat is a prime destination for climbers. There are hundreds of summits and thousands of climbing routes. many of them hundreds of meters long. It is said that the spires of Montserrat must have inspired Gaudi's design for the Sagrada Familia. As we gaze at the tubular forms that hover over the monastery, it seems like that must be true. Statues of the saints stand sentinel beside a wide plaza. From this vantage point, the valley stretches out below. In the lobby of the church sits the marble tomb of Admiral Villamari, who led the Catalan fleet in the middle of the 15th century. The church was plundered and destroyed by the French during the Napoleonic War of 1811-1812. For several decades, the monastery lay in ruins, but in 1844 it was restored to its former splendor. The main shrine of the temple is the statue of the Virgin Mary carved from black poplar. According to legend, the Black Madonna, as she is called, is the work of Saint Luke and was brought to Montserrat from Jerusalem in the 9th century. During wartime, the Madonna was sheltered by local residents, and now she occupies a place of honor in a special chamber above the altar of the cathedral. After visiting the Madonna, supplicants light votive candles which are symbolic of their prayers for health, success, or the souls of the departed. We ourselves are not religious, but in a world that can often seem chaotic and dangerous, it's not surprising that people who feel they don't always have much control over the course of their lives take comfort in appealing to the supernatural. This sand drawing of the Black Madonna lay at the entrance to the church. The Museum of Montserrat Monastery, to our surprise, has a remarkable collection of paintings, including an early Picasso and a work of the equally famous Spaniard Salvador Dali. We couldn't leave Montserrat without visiting the top of the mountain. There are trails that lead up from the monastery, which normally we would have preferred, but with limited time available, we took the funicular instead. With a grade greater than 45 degrees, this is the steepest funicular in Spain. In fact, there is a trail that you can hike up from the valley to the monastery instead of taking the railway. But we would have needed to spend a full day to do that, and it would have been fairly exhausting. You can, however, stay overnight at the monastery hotel if you have such ambitious plans. From the funicular, close-ups of the texture of the famous rocks are visible. The ride takes you up another 250 meters from the monastery. As you might expect, there are great views at the top. Sacred sites, including caves occupied by monks in past times, are said to be located in this area. Look closely and you can see two climbers at the summit of one of the pinnacles. This remarkable natural wonder has inspired seekers of spiritual enlightenment and nature lovers for a millennium and probably longer. These jumbled stone massifs could serve, without any embellishment, as the setting for an epic fantasy. As for us, these glorious formations served as a grand finale for our excellent 5 days in Barcelona.